Amreen, can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yes, I can hear you too. Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. We organize critical and courageous conversations about social issues, global issues, about social justice and equity studies. Today, we'll talk about education in Bangladesh, and I have a star guest with me, a visionary Bangladeshi educator. Obviously, Amreen is a Harvard graduate and currently doing her PhD at Trinity College, Dublin. Like, my goodness. So, Amreen has a very excellent academic career. And Harpern is working with something very fascinating, that the education technology in Bangladeshi context. And we wanted to engage in a conversation to understand questions like equity, questions like fairness, to understand that what does it mean to be educated in 2021, understanding that in the context of global capitalism and neoliberal digital capitalism, where do we stand? So there are so many things that we're going to talk about. And I know Amrit has a very busy schedule. I kind of bugged her a lot to say, give us an hour. So I have finally gotten this opportunity. Amrit, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Amrit, the first question to you is that you are doing something really fascinating, and reading the report that I've looked into and also your current PhD project as a doctoral researcher, it seemed to me that you're looking into a lot of social justice issues. You are passionate about equity and fairness. Could you tell us about yourself, that basically your upbringing, the kind of values that you developed, and why do you care about things that you care about? Your positionality, in other words, when we talk about research.
Sure. My name is Amreen Bashir, and I am a Bangladeshi American. So I was born and raised in the States, but I've also gone to school in Bangladesh, both in a British private school as well as an American international school. And I have worked in Bangladesh as a teacher in different international schools. At the same time, I've worked with nonprofits in Bangladesh, and I think that my my positionality comes from having been a part of both worlds, understanding what equity looks like in each country and what equity looks like worldwide, and seeing the gaps in both countries of what where we long for equity but we don't reach it. And that's sort of been one of my drivers for change, I suppose. I am My mother's an educator, and she's always been a very, very big proponent of having equitable access to education. That's something that I share with her. That's something that we both really, really are passionate about. Is, once you control education, you control a whole populace, and the idea is that education shouldn't be controlled. It should be something that's available. It should be something that is a right rather than a privilege. And at the moment, in many aspects and in many countries of the world, whether it's developed or less developed, it is still an aspect that's very much controlled, and it's used for whatever political means of the day. And I believe that if education is we say education is a right, but we don't deliver the right education to everybody. If you come from a wealthier background, you receive certain things with more resources. You receive a different kind of education, and if you come from a less than um, privileged background, you receive something that's very different. And so there's that difference that I think is unacceptable. Really, that difference should not exist. That every child should get the same resources and the same sort of skill sets that are taught in more privileged spaces, so that they have a better chance at choosing for themselves what they want to be and how they want to make an impact in their societies. So I think for me, it's that there's a saying in Hindi that's "Dhobi ka kutta na ghar ka khat ka," which literally means that you're a mutt, that you don't belong in one space or the other space. And I think it's that third culture aspect of my life where I'm American, but I'm Bangladeshi, but I'm Indian as well, from my background, and I've lived in many countries where I feel a little displaced. But I think it's that displacement that has worked towards my my ethics, and it's worked in my favor in that it's that sense of belonging everywhere and nowhere at the same time, where I think that that universality of being in many different places has always contributed to the fact that if that's the case and I'm still me, why is it that in countries or in spaces where in communities where people are in the same space, that they're still experiencing inequality that should not happen? So that's something that has really influenced me and really made me think about how can we make things more universal, not necessarily exactly the same in the sense that each context has its own thing that they need, that they have their own education system or own special their own needs that are contextualized to their own spaces. But I think that skills are universal, and those are some things that we need to really focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why this conversation could be extremely useful for um, our students who will actually, again, we use these conversations to facilitate critical consciousness among Bangladeshi students and marginalized communities across the world. The advantage that we will have our today's conversation is you also have majored in history in your undergraduate, and you, as you have beautifully mentioned, that the marginalization, not belonging to one place, actually compels us to imagine a new possibility, which probably we would not. Let's say if you were a white American born in a very privileged community, an affluent community, probably you would not think about a lot of things what you think right now. So and it's fascinating that how you are a woman of color. You have gone to uh, you are a Bangladeshi American, and you just mentioned, I didn't know that you have a bit of Indian background. So I sometimes make fun with my friends that whenever I try to speak one or two sentences of Hindi, it sounds terrible. So I know they make fun of me, and I understand it. So um, your exposure to so many cultural background, having your roots spread out in so many places, has given us will give us the opportunity to situate our conversation today. You have attended high school in Bangladesh. When we say that you went to a private British school, and then you also have gone to American International School of Dhaka, which is probably the most exclusive school in Bangladesh. And obviously, you're a Harvard graduate. So, I mean, this gives us so many vignette to actually talk about. Now, starting with, we know the myth of meritocracy, and there has been enough literature written, understanding that how education is inescapably political, and we know in at least in the context of United States that how education was used politically to suppress, to uh, marginalized communities like African American, indigenous communities, immigrant communities. Um, and we see similar kind of structural inequality reproduced in Bangladesh. And this is what I'm going to start with a very bold provocation. I want us to imagine or to consider this, that in Bangladesh, we see something, dare I say, it's you can say an academic apartheid, where you have schools where students, like in Bangladeshi taka, you'll have to pay more than 4 million for tuition fees. And then you have schools in Bangladesh where students can afford to get even basic um, necessities. In Bangladesh, less than 0.5% students attend to these schools. The schools that I'm talking about, the elite schools of Bangladesh. Um, these are the students who become the global leaders. Um, I'm sure that you can give many examples of your friends who have gone from AISD to Harvard. But I don't think you'll be able to find many, I'm not saying there isn't any, many examples where somebody, I'll tell you this, the school that I finished my high school from, that's 102 years old school. This is not about me, but understand this is not about a person, it's about a structure. I'm the only person that I know who has somehow escaped from that village and studying here. So I want you to talk about, as blatantly, as unapologetically as possible, to talk about the politics of education that you have seen in American context and also in Bangladeshi context, and how we portray the myth of meritocracy. Everything happens because you are gifted and the rest of them, they're not.
So, I mean, the politics of education exists everywhere, whether that's Bangladesh, whether that's the United States, whether that's Chile, whether that's, in Angola. Like, it exists everywhere. And it has to do with just socioeconomic status, right? So, I mean, yes, the government and how government structures their place, what kind of resources that they give, but also the resources that they give are funded by property taxes and many other things that are very situational. It depends on how much tax you pay, which is where you get the resources. Like if I give a U.S. context, even today, if you look at neighborhoods that are not as wealthy. They're not paying as much tax, and ergo, their school systems don't have all the latest gadgets or don't have all the resources that another school would, right? So I'll give you an example from my own life. When we were moving to Georgia, my mother was looking at different neighborhoods, and she was looking at SAT scores. That's how in the States you sort of try to figure out what two different standardized scores you figure their results. You realize how maybe good that school is or their education system, and it was in areas that were more affluent that had the higher SAT and standardized testing scores. And that is a number of things that come into play. So when you have more money, you have the opportunity to have time to study more. You also have the opportunity to be able to pay for tutoring, to pay for other things that you might need to get ahead in whichever context it is. If you are in a more affluent position, you are also better fed in many ways. So your nutritionally, like Maslow before Bloom, your basic needs are met at a more readily. They're met more readily than they are elsewhere. You're not worried about where your next meal is going to come from. You're not worried about if you're going to be evicted. You're not worried about a lot of things that you might have to worry about in other situations. And so you can focus your time in academia. You can focus your time in trying to excel in the one thing that you're supposed to be at that time, which is a student. um, think about reading. Like there was a study that was done about children whose parents read to them, and the children whose parents read to them are the parents who have the luxury of time to read to their kids and have the ability to do so themselves because they are educated. And so this is a divide that's systemic, and it's also it's longitudinal. It's not something that happens in one space at one time. It's a generational thing. It breeds itself, and that is something that you'll see worldwide, whether that's Bangladesh, whether that's America, whether that's anywhere else. It's sort of an open secret. It's around. So the politics of education always exists. That has always been the case. It has never. You can't divorce education and academic excellence from your socioeconomic status and from uh, the privilege that entails. So, my answer to that question, I guess, would be it's an open secret. It's always there, right? So it's not that it's only a Bangladeshi problem. This is a worldwide problem. This is a
Yeah,
historical
yeah,
problem. It's not even that it's now.
yeah, yeah. Would you say that, behind this, I mean, one of the things that happens, we talk a lot about, particularly when you talk about sociology of education, when you talk about Bourdieu, we see that you go to school, you have given a beautiful example that kids who have the privilege or have had the privilege to have parents who were university educated read to their parents. I give this example to my son all the time, is that I talk to my son and he gets to know about a lot of literature, a lot of historical facts and figures that he doesn't have to know by going to school. My son, uh, just because that and I have my immigration here, I mean, will have a lot of benefits, privileges without earning them. He's going to inherit all of those things, right? Um, and my son speaks in a certain way because I made a conscious effort from childhood that this is the dialect of Bangla. This is the kind of Bangla you speak because this is the Bhadraloke Shikhito Bangla, right? So as opposed to this, we see that this is literally a hierarchy that is artificially constructed, socially constructed, but then that becomes a means for justifying the structural oppression onto those who do not meet. It's like you and I are going on a race and your feet are tied and you don't even know that your feet are tied. And I'm saying, hey, I won the race. And when you talked about, even Bloom, Master before Bloom, we know from Howard Gardner in the 80s, the study that the theory of multiple intelligence is that the entire assessment system in education is biased towards the privileged, towards the rich, kids, because knowing to read and write, producing abstract idea is probably one of, obviously the number keeps on increasing, but think about the kind of intelligence the kids on the street demonstrate. Can you imagine, the kids who go to schools like Scholastic or American International School of Dhaka be able to survive a day on the street like you see the kids who are selling fruits and vegetables on the streets? That would be impossible, right? But their capabilities of surviving on the street, their capabilities of understanding the society, the emotional intelligence will not only be delegitimized, they will be judged by saying, oh, these are smart. Um, what is the Bangla expression? Khub challu kids. This is not a positive connotation. It doesn't have a positive connotation. It is very insidious. Their survival capacity on the street, the kind of capacity they build, is actually used to delegitimize them, to marginalize them, to vilify them, right? So, could you speak about in your because you didn't only go to school in Bangladesh, you also have been a teacher in Bangladesh. Starting from technology and sort of like epistemology, is that what kind of things are taught, what kind of if you talk about epistemic violence, if you talk about neocolonialism in school system, what are the kind of knowledges are taught in school, what gets privileged, what gets marginalized, in your experience, could you tell us about it?
So I wanted to address something that you first said, which is that the education system favors the privileged. And I wanted to address that for a second because I wanted to say something to it, which is the education system was created by the privileged. And so naturally, it does favor the privileged. You know, the people who had to read and write were the ones who could read and write. You know, like if you look at 100 years from now, they weren't toiling in the fields. They were the zamidars, or they were the landowners, or they were the first industrialists, whatever have you, right? They had the disposable income to think about what an education system would be for their progeny and also their workers, right? So there's different tiers of education systems that were created for those specific reasons, who are going to be the workers, who are going to be the leaders, and who are going to be. So I wanted to address that first, as you said. And that, to answer your question, as a teacher, what do I see? I see that, right? So that's something that's been perpetuated throughout time. And this is not just a Bangladeshi problem. This is everywhere. I mean, if you look at the US and you look at how the US is stratified and how education systems are for public versus private schools versus the elite breeding ground schools, there's a whole different category of those schools, right? So if I have $50,000 a year to send my kid to school, he's going to go to Yale or Harvard or something else. I mean, it's almost like that's what they're structured for, right? Versus if my child goes to a public school, then in an affluent area, he has those chances, or she has those chances. If it's in a less than affluent area, then we're happy if they graduate. And so the expectations are placed on um, the level of income that they come from. It is. And that doesn't change wherever you go. You know, I think mass education worldwide has been created for a specific purpose that it serves, for whom they serve. And it is a very, that statement I say very willingly, whom they serve, because it serves somebody or a class of people. And I have yet to see in my experience, and maybe I will be happily corrected. I have yet to see an education system that was built not to keep people in the structures that were already placed. If you're privileged, you go to that. If you're not, you go to that to serve the privileged. And so the education system almost perpetuates that cycle. And I have not met any other education system I have not met any education system that actually breaks that. I mean, I've seen many that have tried. I think there's a lot of noble efforts. I just haven't seen any that have actually worked, which is one of the things why I really enjoy technology and believe in technology, because it's been a great disruptor in many ways. And I think that ed tech might be a way to navigate this problem. But at the same time, in order to access technology, you also need to have some sort of socioeconomic status. So like the barrier to entry is already high. So it's this, it's a, cat and mouse sort of dance that we're doing, where it's, I think technology can be the equalizer, but in order to be an equalizer, it needs to be accessible. And in order to be accessible, it needs to be cheap, and it's not.
I mean, Amreen, hats off to you. Not a lot of people would recognize this blatantly, that the education system that was created by the privilege, for the privilege to keep the rest, on there. And then I think you have addressed it adequately in order to also see the relationship that um, what was the purpose of mass education, right? I mean, if you look at education's service, education's the how education's designed. So I will quote here Walter Lippmann. At least in let's talk about America, and then probably we can talk about Bangladesh to see the similarity and how also the differences. So in American context, a handful of people, and there's a wonderful book about it. It's called The Necessary Illusion by Noam Chomsky. Chomsky argues, giving obviously a lot of documents, understanding is that, see, the difference between countries where you have dictatorship where you have authoritarian government, let's say North Korea or China. It's like, okay, you guys are the dictators, you decide whatever you want to decide, plain done. But if we go back to the let's say the social revolution in the UK, uh, uh, right after seeing the French Revolution, is that they have understood very well that by physical means, by force, you will not be able to suppress people. So in the so-called democratic society, they needed to create an apparatus. They needed to create. Louis Althusser has also talked about it. The ideological apparatus of the state is that by controlling the mass with force, using brute force, you are earning a bad name, and you're actually losing the legitimacy to general people, right? So in the so-called Western modern society, education was a very useful tool to indoctrinate the mass to accept the oppressive apparatus, state apparatus, and to normalize it. And there we go. We see in the United States, for example, discourses like the welfare queen, discourses like that the black mothers, they are lazy, they don't want to work, and that's why, even to the extent of the idea of, I mean, we all know about it. And when I actually saw when that book was published, The Bell Curve, it was published in 1994. And by the way, that book was published not by, general American. That book was, written by scholars at Harvard. Get that. That book was written by a Harvard psychologist and Princeton political scientist, that African Americans are genetically predisposed to be less intelligent, and which is why their place in their life. And this totally delegitimizes and invisibilizes the history of colonial capitalist violence, the history of slavery on the African Americans. Now, that's in American context. Now, let's come to when I was saying that Walter Lippmann, people like them, is like, okay, it's the responsibility of a handful of incredibly intelligent people to control, to shape the minds of the mass so that they serve the purpose of the state. Now, in Bangladeshi context, let's see what's happening. Less than 0.5% students go to this international education system, and they come from, dare I say, very affluent background. Now, you're talking about ed technology. I agree with you. I have I'll tell you that I teach kids in my village sitting in Canada. Wouldn't be possible if this technology wasn't there. I can tell you that kids in my village are learning how to program. They talk about artificial intelligence. They talk about, data science. They talk about data colonialism. If we didn't have this technology, I've told you about the World School of Bangladesh. The whole objective is to disrupt the educational structural barrier in inequality. Let's focus for some positives. That what do you think some of the possibilities you see in Bangladesh that the education technology can disrupt the structural inequality in education and economic system, employment, and other opportunities?
So I think, one of the things that so I'll say something first and then I'll go to your question, is
Mm,
that despite, and this is a wonderful thing, is
mm,
despite many structural inequalities, and despite the few creating an education system for the many to serve the purpose of the few, we have seen over and over again, people rise up, right? And people in their own local contexts teach what they need to teach in order for their kids to excel. At the end of the day, every parent, regardless if it's a rich parent, if it's a less than affluent parent, every single parent wants their child to succeed. They hope that their child will do well, right? So I've seen incredible stories in a smaller scale, not at a national level. So when my previous comment, I have to address and say that it was at a national level. But I have seen at a local context, at a smaller level, people really breaking the mold and doing more and going distances that you wouldn't have thought possible, and proving us wrong that, even if you try to suppress a mass, the people aren't cheap. Like, they're just not going to go along. they do rise up, and they do better for themselves, even despite with the structural barriers that were placed on them intentionally, right? So that's something that I did want to say. When I In terms of education technology, I see a huge promise in education technology because you have structural inequalities like high student to teacher ratio. When you have one teacher to 50, 60 kids, it's not that poor teacher. They're trying their best to reach all 50, 60 students, but as a teacher, I can tell you it's very, very difficult to make sure that if like the 50 children are on the same page. And you don't understand until you get to the assessment level, right? Until you're testing them, that they didn't get it. That some of them, and teachers aren't telepathic. They don't know by just like reading your mind if you got it or you don't. So if you're a shy kid and you were sitting there and you didn't get it, that person has no way of knowing until it's too late, or until it's at least at a point where you're being penalized for it, right? Whether it's a test, whether it's an exam, whatever it is. So I see education technology as a great classroom assistive tool. As an educator, I do not think that ed tech should or will replace schools or teachers. I personally just don't believe in that. I think there's a huge human aspect to education and to schools and to teacher-student relationship that transcends just the curriculum. There's a lot more to it than that. But I do think that they could be assistive sources. So if I'm a teacher and I have 60 students in a classroom, and maybe I have some tools, whether that's a laptop, whether that's a phone, whether that's a tablet, and then I can at least assign a few groups certain tasks that they can then do at their own pace, or they can go back and re-record, rewatch the recording, whatever it is. It's For me, I think it's an assistive tool in areas that are very hard to reach, where they don't get the education system, the normal education system as we have it. It could be a tool where they at least get basic education. They have something rather than nothing. And for me, I think the first and foremost, not inequality, the first and foremost barrier that it does address is the high student to teacher ratios. The other thing that I think it does is it offers more models of learning. So um, social cognitive theory talks about how we all, as students, as people, we look at other models for our life, for to learn. We learn by observing, whether that's observing our peers or observing our teachers. We learn through observation. And Brofenberner talks about this as their exit system, right? And from the 80s, Sesame actually started doing this kind of research. From the 80s, you have research that supports and suggests that if you are in a space where you only have one model or two models of um, where you from whom you learn, whether that's one teacher for 50 kids and plus the textbook, or you are learning just from your parents, ed tech could give you another venue, another avenue where you are learning from different models, whether that's in a TV show, whether that's in a tablet, whether that's in a mobile phone. You're engaging with different models. If you take the concept of the machine out of it, the tech out of it, it's still another model that you're learning from. So that, I think, in itself adds to it. And I think the final piece of it would be that it's not limited to a geographic area. It doesn't matter whether you live in the chore. It doesn't matter if you live in a space that's 7 miles away from your school and you can't physically go there. You can have it in the palm of your hands. You can have it readily available if you have it, right? So that's a big if, and we can talk about that later. But if you have access to a device of whatever kind that supports the education software of your country, or the softwares that you can subscribe to, you have at least something that you can learn from. So I think, especially as women, that is something that is very valuable. Whether it's because girls can't go to the schools for societal reasons, or they can't go to the school for geographical reasons, or they can't go to the school because of inequity. They can still have a chance to get a basic education if they have the drive to. And you know that is another aspect of it that we should also think about, is that you can give, and it could be even at AISD or at Harvard, you can give somebody all of the things, but if they don't want to utilize it, then it doesn't matter how much money they have. They're just not going to utilize it. And we've seen cases of that worldwide all the time. We see it all the time. But what I found in my academics, my research, and as a teacher is, especially in Bangladesh, and I've been very impressed by it, is the hunger for learning and the hunger for wanting to know more. And I think, especially in the hands of these students, if we can give them more models for learning and we can give them more access to education, it'd be we've moved away from the industrial phase of our lives. We're no longer in manufacturing. We're not tied to the secondary aspect of life. We are now in more of a like tertiary quaternary thinking of our world. It's more skills based. It's more based on our ability to think rather than to just do. By do I mean just physical labor. It's more a lot of things are more based on our intellect. And so if we can help them cultivate that, it would be fascinating to see how much human capital that we can harness and what we can actually do in a country where majority of the population are young.
I mean, couldn't agree more with you on that. Could you also speak on that, Amreen? Your concern that you say, and I agree with you 100%, but I want to know, what's your take on that? Like you, I also am a teacher. I've been teaching for over 2 decades. So, why do you think that technology, given that we live in the time of exponential technologies, artificial intelligence, big data analytics, and all of that. And we know all the techno-utopianism prevalent that comes from the mecca of technology, Silicon Valley. Why technology cannot replace a teacher? What is there?
A teacher is not just an app, right? A teacher is a person. And when you, um, okay, I'll give you an example. So if I go into a classroom, I'm not looking at my students as different student ID numbers. They're people, and they have a story. They've got needs. They have interests, and they're good at certain things. So if, let's say, student, let's call him Bobby. Let's say Bobby's having trouble at home. His parents are fighting. That directly will affect how Bobby is going to be retaining information, paying attention in class, and also acting out. Right. So if I'm a piece of technology, I don't know that Bobby's parents are having trouble at home because I'm not talking to Bobby. Like there's no space for that kind of conversation to occur because it's a very transactional thing with tech and a person. It's you log in, you do whatever it is you're supposed to be doing, and then you learn from that and you leave. But if you're having a bad day, the technology doesn't know that, but we do. As teachers, we do, because we can see them. We can ask them how they're doing. We understand their stories. There's more to a person than the parts that they are made up of. Like they have a whole story. They've got dreams and hopes that rapport with the teacher brings out, right? And so that itself, that understanding from a human aspect is very important. And the other thing is a champion. Kids, um, every child needs a champion, and tech can only do that to a certain extent. It can give you stars if you do well in a lesson. It can put you on a leaderboard or whatever, but it's not going to tell you that you're doing really well all the time. It's not going to tell you. It's not going to give you different pathways of, you should you should maybe try this, like go here, like I think you'd be really good at this, give it a shot. And that's completely outside of the realm of the algorithms that it's created of in technology, right? And it's also not going to be the one who's going to ask you if you've eaten, are you okay, did you get enough sleep, like just that champion that every child needs. I don't think technology can do that yet. It could be that years from now, or even now, maybe I'm talking out of turn and there's already AI that's doing this. But that human aspect of recognition, of empathy, really empathy, is nothing that I think can be replaced.
Yeah, I mean, I have it will sound a bit cheeky, but it's based on research, literature. So Alan Turing is considered to be the father of artificial intelligence. So Alan Turing in 1950 has written a paper. It's an 8 pages long paper. It says, can machine think? Right. So towards the end of it, there is a line where Alan Turing is saying is that whether machine can think or not, it is not even a question worth pondering. Because, I'll give you one example that birds fly. We get on plane and we fly. Doesn't mean that we are flying. So the point is, um, and also teaching, understanding that Sushana Zuboff, again another Harvard scholar, has written a book. It's called "The Age of Surveillance Capitalism." My concern, and I had a opportunity to talk to two professors who have written a book on it. It's called "The Costs of Connection." Nick Holdry from London School of Economics and Ulysses Mejias from New York University. I asked them, "What is your concern for a country like Bangladesh?" And this is what they answered. You see, there is a direct political economy of techno-utopianism. You see, when Google or Facebook comes out saying that we want to create one big family, connect the unconnected, right? Now, behind this seeming rhetoric of caring about the world, we have enough evidence. We would be very naive to believe that they really care. Uh, do we not know that Facebook was used for ethnic cleansing in Myanmar? We do. Do we not know that in Ethiopia, Facebook was used for, hate speech? Do we not know that Trump was just what could manage insurrection in the most militarily powerful country in the world, United States, January 6th, right? You couldn't have Trump without Twitter, right? But you see, it is their business model to peddle this kind of unsubstantiated discourse because it serves their purpose, right? A human being is a political animal. We have aspirations and questions, and, you know, not knowing something is of great value. To be in the space of uncertainty, to know that doesn't matter how much you know, you will never be able to reach certainty. Zuboff, in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, talks about the implications of technology in shaping our behavior. You and I would be very naive to think is that technology cannot shape our behavior. Um, I think you have an excellent researcher, Tristan Harris, technology ethicist. He talks about that how technology is shaping our behavior, at least in Canadian context. Every year Canada has some top research priority. In Canada, out of these 16 research priorities, two research priorities we have at the moment is that the rise of disinformation, is that right now we literally live in a time when we do not know what to trust, what not to trust. The researchers call it reality vertigo. And the other thing, which is connected to this, and I want us to talk about it, is the rise of a social individual. When kids go to school, when they're in person, you can't perform self when you are in person. But when you and I post a photo on social media, we are performing a self. In our selfie, we're always smiling. But in real life, we don't. We, out of 30 days, most days are challenging. You know, particularly you lived in you grew up in the United States. Now you're in, you were studying in, at Trinity. Uh, Tell me, how much do you think that people in Bangladesh romanticize the life in global north? That, when you're living in the United States, you're always having a party, you're always driving car, everything is nice and, hunky dory, right? But when you are in person, you are growing up with a person, you can't replace that. But that techno-utopianism, as when you were saying that maybe there is an artificial intelligence that can probably read emotion, the guy, Alan Turing, is saying that's not even a question. But if Elon Musk says that, if Mark Zuckerberg says that, or Sundar Pichai says that, that is against their business model. They're not going to say it. Humans can. Sherry Tarkle, another MIT researcher, has been studying the implications of technology on human emotions for nearly 4 decades. We are literally raising a generation of asocial individual. We don't know how to navigate relationship in person to person. What's your thought on that this techno-utopianism, how it can actually misguide us, especially us parents? I mean, I'm a parent and I'm a teacher, so I think about the way I think about my son, and I also think about, like, okay, what's this implication to the children?
I mean, that's a really interesting question, and that's a PhD topic on its own, right? But I think that, or probably more than that, but I think that in my own experience as an educator, when I first started teaching, Facebook was a thing for adults. It was, you had to have a college ID. So it was very much a college student thing. And it was relegated to that realm, more or less. It was more for college students to like connect with other college students, and it didn't have that social hype that it does, or the power that it has now. And now Facebook is archaic for our younger generations. Like, they're going on to all these different, they're on TikTok, they're on Instagram, Snapchat, Discord, like anything else, right? So they like, Facebook is like something for their parents. They don't even want to be there. But this idea of always showing that everything's hunky dory, like everything is great. I'm having the best time of my life. I could be miserable. I could be actually miserable, but on social media, on my Insta stories or on my Snapchat feed or whatever it is, I am like having the best time. That really, I think, as an educator, what I've seen is that it really does take a toll on students. It messes with their minds, because it is messing with their minds. They're publicly portraying something and privately experiencing the parallelism of politician. That's what we're doing. Even our kids are politicians. They are portraying one thing, but they might be going through something else. But their platform is their social media. That's their campaign. That's their platform, and that's what they're perpetuating, is that this is my life. This is how great it is. You hear about things where people are going to debt in order to just have more Instagram posts of exotic things or whatever it is that they're doing. So I think that social media, in that respect, or this utopianism, as you call it, or as you've labeled it from others, is very real. It's something that is happening. I also think there's a flip side of it, that if social media can also be used to network, it could also be used to learn, and you have to first be able to have discerning skills to know what how to navigate that, and understand bias and prejudice. And that's a skill that most students don't get a very good education on, and that's something that we really need to focus on anyway, whether that's reading through 8 newspapers and formulating your own opinion, which most people don't have the patience to read through one. So it's something that we need to cultivate more as a society and more as an education system. But at the same time, technology is not going anywhere. You and I can like you and I can like reminisce about the days when there were no computers, but I'll be honest, I grew up with them. Like I grew by the time I had my ability to critically think. Dial-up was around. We were on AOL, and we were already computers were around. Like I don't remember the last time I had to look at an encyclopedia to figure something out rather than Google it, right? So I'm very much a product of this environment, and as a result, I don't know life without it either, right? So I can talk to my parents, and they have all this. These stories that they want to say, they tell me that we had to go to a library and look at 15 books before we could formulate something. And my first thing that always comes to my mind is, who has the time to do that? Like I will Google it, and I'll have 1,000 resources at my fingertips, and I will always inevitably go to a first few that I am partial to, and then go and find more if I don't want to. And you're right, that creates an information bias and tunnel, right? So if I am not than others, then inevitably I'm going into a cycle that is probably potentially quite dangerous. And that's what you have, these rise of hate campaigns, and you have all these rise of like more division, because people are from the people that are agree with them, essentially, and perpetuate the same views that they have, so they're never understanding something else. But I think that's where the that kind of the onus lies on the educators at this point. On that is that you need to teach, and we need to teach our students that somebody who doesn't agree with you is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It gives you a different perspective. And if you can actually sit down and listen to why they're not agreeing with you, you can disagree with them. You can agree to disagree. That's okay. But it doesn't have to resort to violence. And you might actually learn something. You might actually learn something from their perspective. And so I think that's where you cannot replace humans. We actually really need this ability to teach students tolerance, and to teach students how to have civil dialogue across different viewpoints and worldviews, socioeconomic classes, all of the above, right? So, is social media bad? That's a really, it's not binary. Like, it's not a yes or no answer. It's here. It's not going anywhere. You and I can wish it wasn't here, but it's here. Like, it's not, it is what it is. So how do we then work with something we have? How do we then work with something that billions of people around the world use every day? If you look at Facebook, I mean, half the people, like, I did a literally just a cursory, not even study, I can't even call it. It was just word of mouth. I was just asking people, like, from the streets, from my friends, to everything, like, what are some of the, like, when you wake up and you use your phone, what are some of the sites you go to? The most popular one was still Facebook. And and if you go to more um, lower socioeconomic environments, internet is Facebook. So if that's the case, we need to work with Facebook. We need to work with the fact that that's not going anywhere. So how do we then navigate this system so that it doesn't perpetuate the hate that it has? And you're correct, it has done a lot of damage. It has also brought the world together on a platform that has never before seen its likes, right? I can now chat with somebody 15,000 miles across who I was friends with 30 years ago, versus my parents' generation, who are now finding each other on Facebook. It's, again, it's here. So how do we, I think the question isn't, is it good or is it bad? And the question isn't about tech utopianism, because that's not the question, which is, how do we use the existing platforms to engage in a more equitable conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you on that. Let's focus on Bangladesh right now. Is that one of the things that we know that the current government came with one of the very strong political mandate of making Bangladesh digital Bangladesh. Now, right now, we have more than 100 million people connected to the internet, right? Okay. Now, if the digital capitalism is dependent on data for fueling its growth, it's great for the company, right? But the question is, I'm going to go into a Marxist analysis. Is that, let's say in the past, if you'd have worked for my company, I'd have to pay you wages, right? But let's say now I am on the social media or I am on TikTok or whatever you say it. I am generating the raw material that is fueling your growth. So here we have a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we don't have escape out of it. You will be connected whether you want or you don't want. The forces of capitalism is going to prevail. End of the story. But the second thing is that how do we turn it on its head? Can the dream of digital Bangladesh materialize if we do not do two things? A, democratize the digital. If the students of AISD or ISD get connected to internet and they learn how to code, it's not going to do anything if the rest of the 99% students, they don't develop that kind of technological skill, right? Frankly speaking, that's not happening. Me using social media is not, I mean, internet is using me, I'm not using internet. So from that point of view, what are your concerns when you think about democratizing the digital, not penetrating in the term of connecting people, but connecting with affordability, giving them the devices, and second, building skills, and third, and this is what we have to also straddle with, it's here to stay. It's not going to go. It is here to stay. It's not going to go. So how can we build a critical digital consciousness so that this great tool does not destroy us? I mean, did you hear me? I'm sorry. I see a slight lag.
I think, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm.
Hello? Yeah. No, as I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
saying, is you're speaking to an educator. So I think my first and foremost answer to that would be is through our curriculum, through our education system. Like that is how we democratize anything, really, or divide anything. It's how you use the tool and how you intentionally build it, right? So I think the first thing is access, as we've identified, to actually just be able to be connected. That's one big thing. And the second is when you're connected, what do you do? How do you navigate it, and how do you understand how to use it to for your best, to using your best efforts, how to use it to go forward and to gain as much knowledge as you possibly can, whether it's something that the curriculum itself is giving or whether you go and you find it, right? And that's a skill that's also taught in schools. And I think that unless and the government's already doing this, they're really trying to revamp the curriculum, and they're looking at how to best, within the context of Bangladesh, how to best utilize technology, because especially with COVID and with the pandemic, what's happened is education is always around the world one of the sectors that's the most resistant to change, and in a large scale. And the pandemic sort of forced us into a space where we had no choice. And now that it did, people are, and that scramble that we had to do in order to get students to be to just get access to things. Now we're beyond that. Now it's no longer a question whether technology or the internet or remote learning is going to be a thing. Now it's a reality. And so it's, how do we make it better? How do we create a system? How do we create a digital Bangladesh that's actually truly uh, digital for everyone? That's actually truly something that everyone can access and everyone can understand and everyone can manipulate. I think there's a third thing that we um, have yet to make strides on, but I do think that that's a conversation on many levels that's happening. It's not something that I think the government's ignoring. I think they're very aware of it, and I think they are trying, because our traditional models of education worldwide is a factory model of education that no longer serves any of us. Our world is not like that anymore in most places. Now, it's not like that at all, but in most places it's not like that. And we know that in order for us to have a competitive edge, even for the wealthy to have a competitive edge, they need the mass to now develop more skills than they needed to before. And so I think that in itself will be a driver for change. I think that in itself is already a driver for change. I think if many governments, not if, I think many governments are starting to put money where their mouth is and starting to understand the value of digital literacy and training their educators, their civil workers, everybody who's advocating or who should be, who's teaching or advocating for these systems, for them to get the training required, to the digital literacy required to be able to understand it themselves, and then go a step further and teach it to the young population. So do I think that this is something that is necessary? Yes. And do I think that this is something that's happening? It might not be there in reality altogether yet, but I do know that the key word is yet, because people are having these conversations. People are starting to think about, how are we going to do this, and not just think. I think we're past that, at that stage of just thinking. People are starting to act on it, and even in Bangladesh, the government has started to revamp the curriculum to have it be more in tune with the world we live in right now. So I think it's a matter of time.
And you're right on point. If it is a matter of time, and we know purely from number that the Gini coefficient, what is saying that in Bangladesh the income inequality has increased, hasn't decreased. Um, Even in the midst of COVID, like and this is not only in Bangladesh, similarly in the worldwide, is that we have seen an unprecedented wealth accumulation for the richest, whereas more than 400 million people have lost jobs. Um, if this is the trend, the income inequality is increasing. If it is the reality that people are losing their capacity to maintain their basic living standard, are we targeting for something like, how do you see it? Income inequality rising, not decreasing, and at the same time materializing the dream of digital Bangladesh.
So this is now going to dip into my undergraduate history degree, and I think
Mhm,
I see things in a very long term pattern. Yeah.
mhm,
Not just the last decade or the last few years or so forth. Like if you look at the last 300 years or 200 years, or even if you look at from, you know, yeah, let's say since the industrial revolution. So let's look at it in the last couple hundred years. Income inequality is not a new phenomenon. It's been
mhm,
happening since we've created markets. The whole idea of creating like these fictional credit systems, these are stories. These are basically stories that we've perpetuated and created systems out of, right? So all of these stories were built to serve certain things, whether that's people, whether that's ideologies, whatever it is. Income inequality has existed for a very long time. Yes, the numbers right now are unprecedented, but to what? We don't have anything else to compare it to. If we look at what the Vanderbilts, how much money they have, the Rockefellers, and all those stuff, they have like, and we translate that to today's dollars, I think they'd be pretty close to the Elon Musks and the the Jeff Bezoses of the world. Like these kind of really high levels of inequality have always existed. Now, it hasn't existed in the kind of numbers that we see today in terms of how many of the people are wealthier, right? So just the sheer quantity of people rather than just the disparity. But I think that that in itself is also an interesting observation, is that there are more wealthy people in the world than there ever have been before, right? And that speaks to, and not everybody comes from the same lineage. It's not a blue blood, like, oh, sorry, a white blooded kind of, like a pedigree that can only reach X or Y. Like that, this is, there are so many people who don't come from the background that are supposed to be wealthy that are now wealthy. Does that still discount the people who've lost their jobs and the millions who are struggling to survive? No, it doesn't. But does that tell me that in this dysfunctional market that we've created for ourselves, that things are that it's serving more people than it did before? Yes. Now, if the question is how do you become more equitable in economics, I think my first answer it will be I'm not an economist, but my second answer would be that it would take a very concentrated effort, not just from the wealthy themselves, but from the government. There has to be structures and policies in place to to almost force a change, right? So if you do not have a multi-pronged approach to solving this problem, where it's not just education alone, it's not just taxes alone, it's not just social services alone. Like it has to be a multi-pronged, concentrated effort to change this disparity. Then yes, I think that then it would work. But unless and until we have a very, very intentional, systemic revamp, I think we will just continue seeing the same trends that we have since the Industrial Revolution, which is the wealthy getting wealthier
Hmm.
throughout time.
Yeah. Speaking about Bangladesh and purely in the questions of equity when it comes to education technology, Bangladesh government spends the percent of GDP allocation for education in Bangladesh. It is less than India. It is less than, and we spend slightly 2 point, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2.1 or 2.2% of our GDP in education. And within that, there's a huge disparity. Huge disparity. Um, we know that, you see, and this is what I'm trying to be mindful that am I going down, sliding down the path of idealistic pessimism, or trying to understand how to get out of it, right? And then I tell you that because I work with the kids in rural Bangladesh directly, from there I have certain observations. Um, During the pandemic, the private schools did not close down. They had internet connection. The private universities continued education, not the public universities. Um, and we don't have enough data. We haven't done any study, but I can tell you anecdotally the number of young girls who have been forced to get married, wed off because schools are not open. We are already, the income, the education gap, and there's also the fact is you can go to school and you have pointed out, you have, what's that English expression, hit the nail on the head, something like that. I can't remember at the moment. So uh, we have in Bangladesh huge unemployment problem. You can go to university, you can get educated. That doesn't guarantee you that you'll be employed. Because we are living in an exponential time. What took 100 years, I mean, from first to second industrial revolution, now that kind of changes are happening in about a few years, 2 to 3 years, 4 years. That's why we call it exponential time, right? I mean, we don't have time. I mean, so even historically speaking, that okay, from first to second, second to third, the countries had 100 years to adjust, right? Now, in the era of fourth industrial revolution and at the time of climate crisis, we can see the consequences of pandemic that we are on the verge of collective extinction. In that case, how do we build a resistance mentality to build solidarity in Bangladeshi context? In Bangladeshi context, I know that you're doing a lot of work. I know that you have also worked very actively producing a report. So, in your research, what have you found so far? Some of the optimistic things that you found is working, and what would be your recommendation to actually bring changes, positive changes?
So one of the first things that I found in my work is that people are collectively trying to address this problem. Players, stakeholders that didn't used to communicate with one another or had bureaucratic dissonance are now putting those aside more readily to tackle this issue of especially students, the learning loss that has entailed in the last couple of years. And you're right, people, no one is trying to. Even the government isn't trying to say that everybody was educated in the last 2 years. They're very aware of the fact that there were a lot of students who didn't have any kind of schooling because they didn't have access to a TV or they didn't have access to a radio or a phone or whatever it is. But where I see the positives is that everyone is really ready to make that change. Like they all stakeholders that previously did not communicate with one another or may not have to this extent are now doing so. They are really making a concentrated effort to say, okay, we've had 2 years of learning loss, which is a huge, huge loss. So how do we now navigate the rest so that our students and our economy doesn't fail, right? So inevitably, if our students don't get the education that they need to succeed in our competitively in our economy, then our economy will also fail, and that's something that nobody wants. Whether it's capitalists, whether it's the government, whether it's the people themselves, because they also have to they need to live, they need their livelihoods there, right? So I think number one is that people are actually coming together and collaborating a lot more than I've seen before. It's quite unprecedented, the amount of data sharing, the document sharing, and the conversations that are already happening. So I think that's a really big one. And I think the second one is also um, innovation. It's been really interesting to see how people have tried to educate students during this time, um, and also how communities themselves have tried to solve this problem, because it's a they know the need. And starting from informal schooling to very very interesting mechanisms that people have had to continue education when let's say public schools were closed, or they couldn't access it, has been quite interesting to understand. And I think the third is this willingness now not only to collaborate but to create a shared platform where you can exchange information, where data is a lot more readily available, and where you can use that data to create new systems, and this idea of being open to creating new systems. So I know it sounds maybe not as concrete as it actually is, but it is quite concrete. It is something that people are very intentionally um, creating together, and it's the creation and the togetherness that I think are huge positives and huge areas for optimism for the future. Are we going to be able change the structure of society completely? I'm not sure. Is it going to happen in the next few years, or as exponentially as our disparities have been? Probably not. However, whereas these kind of conversations were not even occurring, they're not only occurring, they're also being implemented into policies and strategies. And I think that is a real positive change out of all of this.
And what are some of the biggest challenges you see on the way to materialize equitable digital education in Bangladesh?
I think access is a huge one, right? So barriers to entry. Access would be in a country where we have a lot of mobile phone penetration, but not that many for laptops, right? So if you look at internet usage, it's mostly data usage on cell phones, but data costs money. So our affordability is not yet 2% of our income. We're slightly above still, which makes data unaffordable at a large scale for many people. So if that affordability is a big barrier, and it's something that a lot of players are talking about. And it's something that the government actually is quite actively trying to address and trying to understand how to best decrease in many ways. I think the other thing would be, as you mentioned, sort of the things that have already happened during the pandemic. So, for example, the child brides that have already been married off during the pandemic. Like, you can't reverse that unless there's a huge societal shift. So it's that idea of, okay, what happens with these girls now? Now that we're not post pandemic, but now that we're in 20 end of 2021, we're going to go into 2022. Our schools are coming back in person. They've opened, like, but these girls aren't coming back. So how do we then reach these students that have already been excluded from the education system by virtue of what's been happening, right? So I think that's a second, not barrier, but that's a second thing that we need to really focus on and understand how to overcome. And I think the third is the hardest to reach are still the hardest to reach. That hasn't changed. Whether that was pre-pandemic, during pandemic, now it's still the same thing. So how do we then get those students into the fold, and how do we ensure that we're not marginalizing them even further by creating these new systems that they just have no idea about, or that hasn't reached them at all. So not to forget the most marginalized. I think those are three areas that we need to focus on. Is how can we ensure better access, and more widespread access? How can we try and reverse some of the things that have happened during the pandemic as a result of the pandemic? And how can we address the hardest to reach students that were not addressed even before?
And okay, and probably one of the last questions that I want to ask, and you understand this is like an ongoing discussion. We don't have any. So one of the things that I try to do is that in our conversation, if not answer, can we ask better questions? Can we see? Okay, these are some of the things. Like even in my own dissertation, I don't know whether I'll be able to provide any solution to understand the questions of disinformation and social media crisis in epistemic crisis in Bangladeshi context. But I hope to end my dissertation asking some good questions. So uh, you talked about access. You talked about the thing that has happened. Societal things. Now let's talk about content. What we are teaching, right? We see that okay, the syllabus is changing, and but when it comes to readiness, when you actually go in the field, like not hypothetically, not theoretically, you are talking in person with the teachers, right? um, you might find it hard to believe. Sometimes it's easier to a lot of let's say a garment factory worker or a person, let's say on who's like has a rickshaw in Dhaka to be able to jump on a Zoom call, and they will be connected. Um, but do you think our primary school teachers, kindergarten school teachers, and I know this sounds judgmental. I know that this may sound condescending because of the location of rickshaw pullers in Dhaka city, because of where they locate. They seem to be more open to be able to use, not open, like apt in adopting new technology, but the primary school teachers, or a remote chore there, a small school there. Uh, do you think that we are able to revamp the curriculum, train the teachers with that minuscule budget? Like, do you know what I mean? Am I giving you the tool to bring the change that is needed?
So, I mean, I think that's a conversation that's happening on the
Mhm,
ground, and I think that's a conversation that the government is also trying to address.
mhm,
Is the funding adequate for the change needed, right? So,
mhm,
and it's not just the government alone. It's a lot of national, multinational players,
mhm,
international players. Sorry,
mhm,
it's a lot of nonprofits that are, and traditionally Bangladesh. It's not the government alone who's been a sole provider of education. A lot of it has also come from different players in the system who are coming from either foreign entities or homegrown entities, but it's not just the government alone. And that's a conversation that's happening on the ground already. Now, do I think with the amount of money that we have, will it change? Depends on how the money is going to be allocated. So that's one. Depending on how many changes we want to see simultaneously. That's two. And number three is depending on how well deployed that money is to those spaces. Are they actually reaching the spaces that they're meant to? So I think those are three questions to ask to answer a question. So it's three questions, in lieu of one. But
mhm.
are there different are there more pathways available to us right now that don't just limit us to the expenditure of the GDP? I think that's yes. There are a lot, like, Bangladesh is a growing economy. A lot of eyes are on Bangladesh,
Fastest
for
growing economy
many.
in South Asia.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm,
And so we
mhm,
have a lot of publicity that's already being garnered for that reason, right? So I don't think that the onus only lies on governments or international entities or NGOs or nonprofits. I think a part of that onus also comes from our citizens themselves. So, the op-ed that I wrote, which was about investing in Bangladesh's future, doesn't depend. The argument is that we should not depend on even government entities alone or NGOs or internationals. We should look at our own industrialists, at our own corporations, at our own people to fund some of this as well, to help fund some of this. Because at the end of the day, if you have a loss of learning, it also leads to a loss of income for those people, for the industrialists themselves. Like, if you don't have, if our your if your profits are dependent, if it's a homegrown company, especially if your profits are dependent on how much people buy your things, if they don't have jobs, they're not going to buy your things, and so your profits will dwindle. So it is in your self-interest to help fund some of these changes, so that they can come about faster, and so that the students who will be the workers of
mhm.
tomorrow can actually be the workers of tomorrow. So I think that, does the government have a duty of care? 100%. Do the other players who've traditionally been players in this field have a duty of care? 100%. But I think we need some new players that have skin in the game, that may not actually realize that they do, to come on board as well.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much, Amreen. Amra, let's just quickly see our comments and questions if there is any. Dilara, What alternative would you propose to the marginalized people as opposed to digital education, knowing the fact the country? Okay, I think we have already addressed that question. Shongita is inviting somebody. Thank you. Um, Subhashine, well said. I mean, I'm sorry, I should have taken the point at that time. Nice discussion. I was a part of the research project where we tried to understand the access to tech in slum areas, especially during COVID 19. Interestingly, the lack of device was not much of a problem. Huh. Instead, the lack of access to internet was an issue. Good point. Thank you, Shaifun. Um, and
Yeah, I
teachers
mean, we
or
have
schools were,
96% mobile penetration in this country. So there's at least one
hmm,
device per family. So it's not really a device issue.
yeah,
He's correct that it is,
yeah.
it's access to affordable internet. We have access to internet, but it's affordable
Mhm.
internet and people being able to afford it. I think that is
Yeah,
very, very much being addressed right now. That there are a lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
telcos and the government
Mhm.
and a lot of international entities that are really, really trying to address this and trying to
Mhm.
find subsidies and ways to provide internet at either low or no cost to certain education platforms, especially the government ones. So that's something that's already being addressed. We will see. We will see what happens.
Nightbrand says, well said, Amreen. Then this one, sorry, Mr. Azad says, regimes when are captured by dictators, things are transparent. When education is captured by dictators, okay, what parameters to identify the negative shift we are there to address and who are there to address? That's a question
I mean,
beyond
I
my.
think that points to just research and history. There's
Mhm,
enough out there when you look
mhm,
at regimes and how they do education. I mean, if even now, if you look at what China is doing to their education system right now, revamping the whole thing, I think the answer you will find.
Amreen, would you do think that China is actually one of the best example of digital dictatorship, where the surveillance is unprecedented and every move that you make is going to affect your score? This the social scoring system, whether you get on the credit or not. I mean, I don't know. It almost looks like some Aldous Huxley's, Brave New World to me. Um,
I mean, China's just an example we know of, right? There are other
yeah,
countries that are doing this that are just quieter about it, right?
yeah,
And there are
yeah.
countries that have been operating that we idealize as well that have been doing different forms of social, um, let's say, surveillance.
Oh my
Um,
God. I mean,
so
sorry, I tell you something. Last week, I found out in my research that Canadian Intelligence Agency, CSIS, Canada's Canada's CIA, they found out China has been collecting data on nearly 3 million Canadians. Like, what are they doing? And like in the United States, Russia and China, they both have been found actively involved in disinformation campaign to create political polarization, science denial, saying COVID is a hoax. They're trying to inject, all the chip and all of that. In Canada, Iran, China, Russia, obviously, from a long time. And I was like, oh my God, do you understand? The onus is on people. Like, well, this is my job. I studied 7 days a week to understand how disinformation works, how the ecosystem works, right? I was thinking, and this came in 2021. 90% people in Canada, 9 out of 10 people are subject to disinformation. And by next year, just in about 1 month later, developed economies, they'll be exposed to more disinformation than real information. Now figure that.
well, I mean, data collection methods are also like really interesting and innocuous in many ways, right? That what we see as innocuous, it could be like an app that tells you what you look like in 50 years, but they now already have your facial recognition, they've got your information and so forth. What you think of as like a simple game is actually data mining on the other end. So it's, like, again, I think it's our education system that needs to
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
address that of like
yeah. I
how to
mean,
discern what you should be subscribing to and what you shouldn't be.
I don't know if you have access to our education minister. If you do, can you please tell him this, that we need to build critical digital literacy if we want to ensure our national solidarity on issues. I found it in a research published, now not my statement, by the way, Oxford Internet Institute published a report in 2020. In Bangladesh, the external agency, Iran is trying to create, the disinformation campaign. Bangladesh is subject to that. Go figure. That I don't know what to do about it. Shamim Bhai, thanks for interesting discussion both. However, I believe you can be a great discussant too, Firoz Alam Bhai. Sorry, Shamim Bhai, আমি বক বক কম করবো from now on. Let me know if you want me to be a host where you can talk about different perspectives of technological aggressions and its impact on country like Bangladesh. Shamim Bhai, it would be my honor. আপনি তো মানে I try to bug you all the time. Thanks to Amreen Bashir for putting reality into facts and speaking in a language which is not only for intellectuals. Good job. I don't know if you know Shamim Bhai, mane, great person, and then respect him, love him. So he's a. I mean, Bolo, you were saying?
No, I was just saying thank you to him.
Yeah. Shamim Bhai is a public health expert, and he's almost done with his dissertation at the University of Toronto. Dilara, the idea of digitalization is yet little ambitious and kinda conspiracy of capitalism. Strongly, my opinion. Okay, in a rural context, this digitalization has raised serious concerns on communal and gender violence. Again, in a very unequal society, giving layman the device with internet without education, educating them is a potential jeopardy.
No, I mean I absolutely agree. Like we need it's not one or the other. It has to be a combined effort, and um, you can't have mobilization of digital education without digital literacy and also
Mhm.
without basic literacy. Like it's not going to happen. So I agree with you on that it has to be a two-pronged or even multi-pronged approach. And in terms of it perpetuating violence, gender violence, and gender inequity, I think traditionally what we've seen, how it's been done, uh, it could have been the case. However, I think given the focus on gender equity that in the last few years, I think that is a an area that people are actively trying to address to 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 not eliminate. I mean, that's the hope, but to decrease, definitely. Like I think that a lot more attention and a lot more preference is coming into training for other genders or other marginalized people that wasn't at the scale that it is right now.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. Shungita is agreeing with Shamim Bhai that Firoz was doing too much bog bog. I agreed. Great discussion, Nazir Islam. Yeah. So as you can imagine, I'm sure that by now you have gotten is that this is the discussion that needs to happen, and once we can cross pollinate our ideas and help each other to grow collectively. And all Jara and people who have been listening to us, thank you very much for asking great questions and also giving wonderful comments. And Amreen, I know that I've told you that 1 hour, but I've taken 1.5 hours. I'm sorry, I've gone over time. Have a great day ahead. You're in Bangladesh tonight and day for me. Have a wonderful evening. সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ.
Thank you
Amreen,
so
one
much. Have
second.
a good day.
Amreen, act a second. Disconnect করো না